also they have some strengths to draw on that people in other treatment courts may not have. Judge Manley talked about the Vietnam veterans and the chronic homelessness. Well, certainly among the more recent veterans, they have more social assets than many other people who come into your treatment program. They're more likely to still be attached to family. They're more likely to have more education, more training, more job skills than maybe people like them in the civilian community. Those are assets you can build on. They haven't burned every bridge yet. Okay, they have not burned every bridge, and many people who come into your court, for example, who've been in and out of jail and have been homeless and have a whole set of difficulties, have probably burned through pretty much all of the social supports they've had. That's not true with today's veterans. When I mean today's veterans, the younger veterans. They still have social assets, and those are something you can really build on with regard to their outcomes. A number of other populations that are really important to be aware of. I don't think I have an accent. Maybe I do. I don't have a New York accent, I know that. I'm not from New York originally. I live in New York now. I'm from Ohio. And where I grew up in Ohio, it was a pretty homogeneous population. Just because we elect the president every 4 years doesn't mean that we're a perfect match for the rest of the country. And when I moved to New York, I still remember vividly, I was a swimmer, and I joined a community center so that I could still continue to swim. And I remember in the ladies' locker room seeing a woman with a tattoo on her arm with a number. Now in Ohio, I never met someone who had survived the Holocaust. I read about it. You knew it, but until I saw her and saw that on her arm, it didn't hit me. That is historical trauma. And what they experienced, they've passed on to their children and their grandchildren, inadvertently or not. And that's true with Native Americans. It's true with immigrants. It's true with a large number of people. There is a historical trauma there that is hard for us to step inside of. And this is true, as I said, with Native Americans, and many populations who you have in California have experienced intergenerational trauma. And that can be part of the missing piece. It can be part of what's keeping them from moving on. We have one of the, in any given week, there are over 500,000 young people under the age of 25 singularly living alone on the streets. Okay, there's over 500,000 kids under the age of, I still think 25-year-olds are kids, but under the age of 25. About 300,000 of those are under the age of 18, living on the street. Now, what drove them there is often trauma they've experienced at home. And of those kids, 20% of them are LGBTQ kids, which is twice the rate of that in the population. So kids who are lesbian, who are gay, who are transsexual, are more than twice as likely to experience homelessness as a kid than their proportion in the population. So this is a group of individuals who get kicked out of their house or driven out of their house, perhaps because of that fact about them. So again, and California probably has a larger proportion. You have a lot of young people. So these are groups of people who you need to work with and work to understand. They're not just your average person coming in, well, they perhaps are your average person coming into your treatment court. So understanding the uniqueness of that trauma is essential to creating programs and creating strategies to overcoming that. Or you'll see the relapse over and over and over and over again. Pain drives people to use drugs. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and says, I think I'll be a drug addict. I mean, that's not usually the process. So it's really important to understand the population. And I mean, California, I don't need to tell you this, I know all about Senate Bill 109. California has experienced an enormous influx of people out of prison. Parolees, and this is reported by California Department of Corrections, between 1/3 and 1/2 of parolees are homeless at any point in time. So you have not only coming out of prison, and is there anyone in here who doesn't think state incarceration is traumatic? Okay, so they're coming out of state prison and they're homeless and probably have very few social supports. So that in itself, if you think about it, a third to a half of parolees are homeless at any point in time. That's a bit, and California is experiencing the largest growth in that population in your communities. They're going to show up in your treatment courts. My guess is they already have. So that's a very, very, it's not unique to California, but you do have a bigger issue with that than most of the other states do. So just a quick summary, this is not changing anybody's, as I said, this is not a paradigm shift for people who devoted their lives to working in treatment courts. You're already there. And part of this is to help you know how to do that better, is to know that part of what's missing, part of what may be missing from policies and procedures are knowing what trauma is, knowing what the signs and symptoms are, knowing who your population is, how it might be unique with them, and learning how to respond. Again, not reacting to that, not reacting to it, but how to respond, and as, you know, it makes everybody's life better. Recovery is a word that, I'm going to tell a story about Judge Manley here. Years ago when I was observing his mental health court, there was a man who, in the mental health court, who had relapsed and started using drugs again. And the district attorney said at the time, and I don't even remember what his name is, but it was the prosecutor, asked what the crime was that he had committed that had brought him back, and he said it was Judge Manley said it was a drug offense. He was arrested for possession, and the prosecutor said, oh, relapse is part of recovery. And I thought that was really interesting. I mean, but so that was the attitude. This is going to happen, okay? It wasn't an assault. It wasn't a home invasion. It wasn't intimate partner violence. It was another drug offense. But that's part of, and sometimes that word is unpopular, but I think that's important to keep in mind, that people cannot recover until whatever is broken in them is given a chance to be fixed. Okay, they cannot recover, and they're not going to stay on the course of treatment and without having their trauma addressed. One of the things I want to make sure that I'm not a clinician, okay? I'm not a clinician. We're not going to talk today about how to deliver trauma services. There are people who do that excellently, and some of you may be in the room. We're going to talk about what evidence-based practices there are, but we're not going to talk about how you do those. Those require special training, hours and days of special training. So we're going to talk about those so you know what might be available in your community, or advocate for certain types of services, but not talk about how to go about, you know, directly providing direct services to people. I don't want anybody to be disappointed that isn't going to be part of what we're talking about today. How are we doing? I'm going to let you hear. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, funds a lot of work around trauma. They fund a lot of trauma services through grants, through direct services. CSAT is part of SAMHSA. Some of you may have CSAT grants. CMHS is part of SAMHSA, and trauma is really a big push of theirs right now in terms of including, we do a lot of training with drug courts through CSAT. The easiest, they've tried to distill down what they want the definition, a universal definition of trauma to be, so that we can all be talking about the same thing. And the easiest way to remember it is we talk about it being the 3 E's. It's an event or events, and it's how the person experiences that event and the effect it has on them. Now, the whole definition is actually in this, okay? It's the very, very top thing is what is trauma. But it's the easiest way to think about it. It's not just an event, because every one of us has experienced a traumatic event and it didn't seem to have long-term problems for us. And sometimes it puzzles us as why it bothers someone else so much and it didn't bother us that much. That's because we all experience it differently. And it has that long-lasting effect. That's really what makes something a traumatic event versus, say, a crisis. crises and traumatic events are not the same thing necessarily. What are some examples of traumatic events that come to mind when you think about trauma? I will call on people. No, you said. Give me an example of a traumatic event. Yes?
Working in family court, we have parents that come in and they have their children removed from them. I can't imagine anything more traumatic than that.
Having children removed from the house. Yeah. Anybody else? She broke the ice, come on. Yes?
Anything physical, like floods, tornadoes.
And you have a lot of those weather-related catastrophes in California too, don't you? Mudslides, fires, earthquakes, yeah. And, okay, go ahead, back. Yeah, a death in the family. And families that are involved in courts have a lot of deaths in their family. Okay? Yes, sir?
Combat in war, being a civilian in war.
Absolutely. And this is something we've come to understand too with how we define combat. It's affecting women soldiers more than in the past. Certainly the nurses during the Vietnam War, they weren't in combat, but they were certainly helping people with combat. They were handling bodies, they were patching people back together. And this has a similar kind of effect on people. Any other examples? We've got, disasters, combat, what else? What did the ACE look at? Childhood trauma, and even living in a household where your parents fight increases your risk of engaging in maladaptive behaviors like smoking and using drugs and drinking, etc. Yes?
Did it also look at living in a household with a parent, a parent that is incarcerated?
Yeah. Hi, Kathleen. I just realized who was sitting back there. Living in a household with parents who are a parent who is incarcerated. Recently, I've been working on a study on juvenile mental health courts, and in our two different courts, half of the kids in our study, half of them, these are kids in treatment courts, had a family member go to prison. Half of them. A quarter of them had lived in a household where someone had attempted suicide. So, I mean, these are the children's lives, okay? This is the household that they're living in. What else? Emotional abuse. A lot of kids report they never were sure they had enough food, or they didn't go to school. There was no one to take them to school. Okay, so these are all types of traumatic events, and I think we hit on most of these. Communities can experience trauma as well. I mean, probably the most obvious is 9/11, and the community was defined very big on that one. But you had the Oklahoma City bombings, you had the Sandy Hook shootings at the school. I mean, unfortunately, we can list them, a lot of them, where it's not just the people who were there who directly experienced it, but the rippling effect can be quite profound. And that's something too, when you're working, if something has happened in your community that would affect your community, the people you're working with, that is something to really pay attention to. Okay, really pay attention to. Maybe someone that's a leader in the community, a pastor or someone has died or been killed. I mean, that can affect people more than just their direct family members. We're going to watch a video. This is, I'm pretty sure this will work. Officer Tully is a police officer who was shot on the job, and she talks about her experiences with that, the effect that it had on her. Now, it is a singular event. Some people have lifetime of trauma, but she describes really articulately what trauma is and what it does. So we're going to listen to Officer Tully, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about.
And then around 10:33 in the morning, a call got dispatched for my sector for a man beating a woman. And I was close to that sector. I was close to where the location of the call was. So I wound up responding to the call, and I had 2 units backing me up at that time. When I got to the gas station where the incident was allegedly taking place, I exited my car and I looked around, and there was nobody there except for two women sitting in a car. And I went to go talk to the women, seeing if they had seen the alleged attack that had taken place. At that moment, a man came around the corner of the mini market and said to me, as he started to approach, I said to him, "I'll be with you in a minute, wait by this car that was there, a yellow Jeep." To which he cupped his hand to his ear and he said, "You want me to do what?" I figured he couldn't hear me, so I repeated myself, and he then started to approach again, saying, "You want me to wait where?" And by that point, he had just closed the space between me and him. He wound up at that point punching me in the face and leg sweeping me. As that happened, the radio that was in the holder on my gun belt wound up getting dislodged. He started beating me, hitting my head up and down on the pavement, and he started talking about how women shouldn't be police officers and how he had to kill me. He was militarily trained. At that point, I remember that he was pulling on my gun, and as he did that, the gun came onto my stomach. It was still, my keepers gave on my gun belt, and now the gun was sitting in the holster on my stomach. And as I tried to hold it in the holster, I remember thinking, if you let this gun come out, you're dead. So then I heard the most sickening sound